In our previous video, we provided an overview of the TOEFL speaking section, including discussing the general layout of the test and the different tasks it contains. We also looked at the first speaking task, the independent speaking free choice task, while discussing some preparation and delivery strategies. Now, as we mentioned before, there are 4 sections on the speaking section of the test, and it's divided up into 2 categories. The independent speaking section, which in the first video we talked about the free choice. Today we're going to look at the paired choice video, and the integrated speaking section, in which there are 4 total tasks. We'll be looking at those in future videos. And once again, we need to remind you the total test time is around 20 minutes. Now in our video today, we're going to be looking at the paired choice task. Now, much like with the first task, the scoring system for the paired choice is pretty much the same. There is a holistic scoring strategy in which they evaluate your overall delivery rather than just focusing on individual errors. Once again, the scores range from 0 to 4. 4 is the highest and 0 the lowest. When you receive your overall TOEFL score, though, instead of just seeing 0 to 4, you'll actually receive what's called a scaled score and a proficiency level. Once again, we'll be using 2 documents during the presentation: the TOEFL Quick Prep download, which is provided to us by ETS, and the TOEFL Speaking Rubric. Both links can be found at the bottom of the video. Well, I find it's helpful to go ahead and jump in, so we're actually going to take the example they provide in the ETS Prep download. Let's take a look at this question. Some people enjoy taking risks and trying new things. Others are not adventurous. They are cautious and prefer to avoid danger. Which behavior do you think is better? Explain why. Once again, you've got a preparation time of 15 seconds, and then you have a response time of 45 seconds. Now, the first thing you recognize in the format is that there are 2 choices instead of just 1, taking the risk or being cautious. And you'll notice that once again the topics involve items of personal opinion, everyday life, and certainly they're not considered to be controversial. Again, you're not going to see references to sex, politics, or so on. Now this brings us to our first discussion of a trick, and that is the idea of, is there really a false choice here? Well, in the free choice task, which was in the first video, we basically just wanted to know your opinion or your experience on a particular topic with no objectively right or wrong answer. But with the paired choice task, there seems to be something a little different here. It seems as if we have to give at least one answer from the 2 possibilities that are given. In other words, we must choose from one of these 2 answers, right? Well, not always. In fact, most of this is based on my experience seeing the different types of responses that ETS has provided to us through some of their official publications. In this case, the question appears to suggest that the 2 choices are mutually exclusive. In other words, that you can choose only one of these answers and defend it. But you will see, and I think this is, again, what I've learned looking at actual TOEFL responses and the way that ETS has evaluated them, that it might be possible to give an answer that uses both choices, but it might depend on the situation. Now, in order to demonstrate this, I'm going to leave our current topic just for a moment and look at another one to help demonstrate. Some people prefer to study in groups. Others prefer to study alone. Which choice do you prefer, and explain why? Now, at first, when we see these 2 choices, it seems once again that we have to choose one of them. But let's think for a moment. Okay, follow our logic here. Could there be times when studying in groups might be beneficial? I think certainly many of us would say yes. And of course, it might be possible that it depends on the school subject that we're studying. So for example, what if you were taking a course that was so difficult that you did need somebody else's help? So, for example, a foreign language class where being able to practice your language skills with someone else might be helpful, thus working in a group. But now imagine in that same language class that you may have to study for a test or something that you have to kind of memorize on your own. So focusing on your own specific problems, for example, maybe memorizing vocabulary. Studying alone might be better for that particular assignment in the class. So the idea here is that to say that I can choose one or the other, it really might depend on the class that I'm taking or even the particular task that I have involved. There might be times when studying in groups might be good for this language course, but then there are other times when you need to focus on your own issues and problems. So in this case, we can see that I could choose one answer over the other, but it might be possible to think that both could be acceptable. It might just depend on the situation. So let's think about now the example that we have, the idea of taking risks or being cautious. Could it depend on a particular situation? Is it possible to take risks in certain areas of our lives and to be cautious and not take risks in others? Could you be both? Again, the prompt itself doesn't necessarily specify. Just as we saw in the free choice task, the wording is just vague enough that we perhaps could interpret the question in different ways. And again, this is largely based on my experience by looking at actual TOEFL responses from students who actually did choose both, depending on the topic, of course. So let's take a look at the speaking rubric to see if there's any other clue that we can get about the idea of what they're looking for. Well, again, much as we mentioned in the first video, the real key is that they're looking mostly to see how intelligible our response can be. And does it seem fairly coherent? So again, notice it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to give a completely logical response based on someone's opinion of logic. For example, the person listening to you may completely disagree with the idea that taking risks is a good thing. But that doesn't really matter. What they're listening for is your ability to explain your opinion. So again, notice that they're looking for how you deliver the response. Do you deliver it in a clear way with only small issues or mistakes or minor difficulties with pronunciation? Again, I certainly believe that one of the things the test is really looking for is your ability to demonstrate your vocabulary and this idea of automaticity when it comes to control of basic and complex structures. And then finally, the idea is that you've developed a topic that's pretty much connected to the question itself, and that you've made a strong relationship between these ideas. So again, you could say, well, both could be possible, but I think what the question would really look for is, could you explain very well the two different situations in order for it to seem like that both would be possible? So again, you would have to say more than just both are possible. You need to explain them. So again, there's nothing here in the description of the task that says that we cannot get a good score if we give both answers. So really the idea here is I think it depends on you, your choice. And again, as we notice, just like with the previous task, the 4 and the 3 responses are the better responses. But once you get to 2, 1, and 0, these particular responses, again, do have some sort of negative language in their descriptors. So part of the idea, as we mentioned in the first video, it really would be beneficial for you to get the official TOEFL preparation guide and listen to some actual responses from students. Because since we cannot include those here in this video, I think that's still the best way to find out exactly what the TOEFL is looking for. So, once again, a good response is coherent, it's relevant to the topic, it contains good grammatical structure, no major errors that prevent someone from understanding you. It contains good vocabulary words, interesting ideas for expression. It's well structured, it has a nice flow between ideas, and using signal words to help organize that flow. Contains few filler ideas. So once again, we want to avoid those long pauses or or And finally, it is intelligible, which means that our pronunciation and speaking both are generally clear. We may have a few mistakes, but for the most part, it's still understandable. Now, preparing the response for this task is pretty much similar to what we saw in the first video, but we do have to take a moment to remind us that preparing for the test and preparing for the response during the test are going to be different things. Part of the idea is we need to develop our skill in order to prepare for this type of task. So if you recall, in the first video, we used a brainstorming activity to help generate words and ideas and to get a better understanding of the requirements for the task. So for this particular activity, we're going to use another brainstorming activity. We're going to call it pros and cons. And this is an activity I use oftentimes in my writing classes as well. So in this brainstorming activity, we'll be exploring the pros, which are those ideas that are in favor of the argument, and the cons, those ideas that are against the argument of both choices. So again, notice we would not have time to do this on the actual test, but this allows us to kind of build a discipline when it comes to quickly evaluating arguments. So that's really the key of this particular activity, is that it's going to help us evaluate which choice or choices gives us the best opportunity to speak. So when it comes to making choices, and again, this is true of the first speaking type, but here in this particular video, since we actually have to choose between two options, oftentimes I get students to think about, well, okay, how can we make choices? Well, there are a couple of different ways to look at it. First, which particular choice are you more passionate about? Maybe you've got an answer choice that you feel strongly that you can connect to, one that you can identify with more deeply. Then perhaps this should be the one that you should choose, because it might give you more to talk about. But sometimes we see an answer choice and we realize, okay, maybe I don't like my choices, or maybe I don't necessarily connect to them, but I can recognize that maybe one choice is easier than the other, or that one might seem more logical, or even more positive in nature. So in this case, perhaps this should be the answer choice we talk about. So oftentimes when you're looking at your choices, think about, can you connect to it in a passionate way? Is it something you feel strongly about? Then maybe make that choice. But on the other hand, maybe sometimes there are choices where we don't necessarily like what we're given, but we do recognize that one might be easier to make. So then maybe that's the one you should choose. So to help demonstrate this brainstorming activity, let's go back to the studying sample question we talked about a little bit earlier in the video, before we actually look at our real example. So I want to pull up my pen tool here for a moment, and we're going to jot down some notes when I think about what are the pros and cons. What are the arguments in favor of studying alone, and what are the arguments against studying alone? Well, first off, when I think about studying alone, one of the first things I recognize that a pro might be is that I get to focus on my own mistakes, focus on my own problems. So I could say focus on problems. Okay, so that definitely seems to be a pro. But a con, on the other hand, is that if I don't have anybody else to study with, what if I don't understand the material? In this case, I don't have anyone to talk to or anyone to help me through the problem. So by studying alone, I'm essentially, I might get stuck and I can't necessarily find help. Okay, what other pros and cons could we think about when it comes to studying alone? Well, for example, I also think about one of the pros of studying alone is that I get to work on my own timetable. Again, sometimes if I try to work with groups, sometimes they have to schedule a meeting for everybody to get together. And of course, in this case, what if not everyone can get together at the time that I'm available? Well, I can focus on my timetable instead of thinking about scheduling for other people. Of course, as we mentioned before, in terms of getting stuck, if I need some help or explanation, it definitely looks like that I wouldn't be able to find it here. So, of course, again, I might need help in this case, and again, this could be a huge con when it comes to the fact that maybe if I'm struggling in the class, it's pretty much going to be hard to find help. Okay, now let's look at the studying in groups argument. What could be some pros to studying in groups? Well, it's not exactly the opposite of studying alone, but certainly with the one thing I can do is I can seek help. Whereas in the cons, one of the cons of studying in groups is, as we said before, what if the group itself moves too fast and I can't keep up? So, for example, what if everyone in the group knows quite a bit and doesn't necessarily want to slow down to help me? Okay, what other pros and cons can we think of when it comes to studying in groups? Well, one thing I can certainly think of too as a particular con, as we mentioned before, is it's trying to schedule meetings, which are often very difficult to do. Again, our schedules may not work. And as we said before, in school, oftentimes if we have different class schedule times, or maybe some of the people in the group are working, it may be difficult for us to get together. And of course, I often think that sometimes the possibility of studying in groups could be that we could actually waste time. Sometimes people get together in groups, and sometimes they don't take it too seriously. So they might actually be wasting time instead of focusing on the topic. But on the other hand, as we mentioned before, we could look for help, and sometimes if we do have people who understand the topic better, we can learn from them. So thinking about the two choices I have so far, studying alone versus studying in groups, the real question here to think about is which argument do I seem to be more connected to? Which one do I seem to believe in more? Well, again, I can't speak for you, but certainly I think for me, I would probably prefer studying alone simply because I can focus on my own issues, and thinking about that oftentimes I might want to spend more time on a topic than working with a group. But keep in mind, it is possible to make both arguments. Clearly, there are some classes that studying in groups may be extremely helpful and perhaps even required. For example, a lot of business classes today oftentimes require students to work in teams. Teamwork has become a very important thing, not only in the business world, but in the academic world as well. So perhaps I could make both arguments depending on the class. Again, in a business class, I could spend time studying by myself, maybe the general terms or ideas. But then there are times I could study in groups to help us work together with projects. So again, I think the idea here is that for this topic, I might be able to make both arguments depending on the situation. But again, this particular exercise is for you to start thinking about your own feelings and opinions. And I also find that it's helpful to generate ideas. So if you'll notice, I usually try to come up with at least 2 to 3 ideas on both sides. That way, it kind of gives me an opportunity to say, that am I thinking through these a little more deeply, taking a little bit more time to analyze this argument. So again, you obviously could not do this during the actual test, but it's a great exercise to help us get to prepare to think faster about the test. Okay, now let's look at our actual topic. So again, the topic here is talking about taking risks versus being more cautious. Now, this is what I want you to think about before we actually engage in this activity. Think about you. Which choice are you more passionate about? Or which choice do you think gives you the most to talk about? Or could both choices work depending on the situation? What I would like for you to do now is to pause the video and take a couple of minutes to fill out this chart. So find a piece of paper and on one side write the top taking risks and then put pros and cons. Then in a couple of minutes when you're ready, return to this video to see some of the suggestions that I'm going to come up with. So now pause the video and you fill out this chart. Okay, well, are we ready? Let's take a look. But first off, I think one of the big pros for me when it comes to taking risks is the possibility to learn something new. So again, I can think about like more education, personal growth. These are the kind of things I think of when we take a risk. We actually can, find a way to develop, to grow personally that I would not have done otherwise, because I learned this something new about myself. However, when I do think of the cons of this particular idea, there is a greater chance, really, when you think about it, a greater chance to fail. Because it's something new and something I may not necessarily have any background with, it is possible that I might fail at this particular topic. That is a possibility. So sometimes when we take a risk and we fail, obviously we may not benefit from it directly. Maybe we try a new job, we go in a new career path, and we don't do very well. Well, you could feel like that maybe we've wasted time in this particular activity. So perhaps you came up with these pros and cons. Maybe you came up with some other ones that we haven't discussed so far. All right, let's go to the next one. Now being cautious. So now I want you to pause the video again and take a couple of minutes to fill out the chart. So on the other side of your paper, turn it over and write being cautious, and then write pros and cons. Take a couple of minutes and see if you can come up with at least 2 or 3 ideas for each one. When you're ready, return to the video to see some suggestions. Okay, so now let's fill out our chart. So when it comes to being cautious, one pro I can really think about is the fact that I don't lose anything. So in a way, I didn't risk something, so I didn't necessarily have the opportunity to lose it. So if I had a job, maybe it's not a great job. Certainly if I took a risk and tried to find a better job, maybe it would be better. But in this case, if it's not, then I would have lost the job that I already had. Or if I think about going back to school and I try something new, what if I fail at it? Well, in this case, I don't necessarily lose anything, or I didn't necessarily suffer from this consequence too much. I basically got to keep what I already had. So not only did I not lose anything, but perhaps I get to keep what I already have. Okay, what other type of pro can we think about? Well, again, in this case, we think about being cautious. Certainly, when it comes to our own lives, we can think about that being cautious might help promote a certain level of safety. Now, notice the topic itself did not necessarily specify in which areas we can think about being cautious, but it did mention something about avoiding danger. Well, again, in this case, when I think about not losing anything, certainly one thing I can think about too is my own life, safety. Certainly, there are those people who feel like climbing a mountain or maybe going skydiving is a way to make their lives more exciting. But a cautious person, on the other hand, could say, well, that might be fun for you, but in this case, I don't want to risk my life. So certainly my own personal safety might be something to keep in mind too. Now, of course, again, this particular question makes it seem like that there was nothing good that would come to a cautious person. The truth is, many cautious people can benefit. We have an expression that we have in English sometimes, is that good things come to those who wait. So again, waiting in this case, waiting for something, or waiting for a good opportunity, is also part of being cautious. So maybe in this case we could also say that we're waiting for the right opportunity. We're waiting for that right choice, that right opportunity that will come along. And again, sometimes taking a risk might put us in the wrong path. Maybe we were supposed to stay, in this particular career, and then maybe something better would come along. But, maybe some people won't agree. Obviously, we can jump over to the cons area, and we realize, of course, that if we don't risk anything, then perhaps there will be no extra reward. Without a risk, without taking any chances, if we wait and wait, what if nothing comes? So, for example, if we have no risk, there could be no reward either, no gain. Which, of course, sounds very much like what we were discussing with the pro argument for taking a risk. Obviously, the chance to gain something might be greater. Another thing we can think about, too, is that part of the world is based on change. Lots of things change in the world, and we need to adapt. Oftentimes, this change is not something we can control. So in this case, if you're trying to just stay the way you are all the time, well, the key here is that we can't control change. So perhaps one of the problems here is that maybe as the world changes, we have difficulty managing it. We can't manage the changes that might happen in our lives. So I definitely think of this could be a huge con against being cautious. Change is going to happen anyway, but if we are too cautious, then maybe we try to avoid it. Well, again, maybe the problem might be bigger if we don't try to handle it. So if we're just, again, being too cautious, then, maybe we will be overwhelmed by this change that happens to us. So again, I hope that maybe you had some of the same pros and cons, but perhaps you had some other ones too. Now, as we said before, making your choice oftentimes does involve choosing one or the other, but could we make both answers? Well, in my opinion, for this particular prompt, I think it might be a little too difficult to choose both. Mostly because I think the question is really asking about how we look at life in general. You might be able to say, well, I can be cautious in some things and take a risk in others. For example, I think if you wanted to talk about your financial situation, sometimes it's good to take a risk financially, but we also want to be cautious depending on maybe what time of our lives. When you're young, it's probably good to take risks, but as you get older, it might be better to play it safe. But anyway, in my opinion, I think I'm going to stick with the taking risks choice. Now, the reason I'm going to do that is, just by looking at our activity, I think that the taking risk choice is probably going to give us more to talk about. And I also think that it has kind of a positive type of message to the idea. Even though taking risks increases the opportunity for failure, I think the idea here is that taking risks provides a potential for something better. A better career or personal growth. And I think many people would agree that when it comes to trying to make yourself better, sometimes we have to take a little risk. We have to try something new. So in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I think I'm going to try the taking risks discussion for this particular activity. But again, I do think, really depending on how you view it, you probably could give both choices if you feel that that would be a better option. Now it's your turn. Which choice would you make? Look at your choices on your pro and con sheet and think which one seems to be the one that you might be able to talk about more. Is it the one that you feel more passionate about? Or is it the one that just seems easier as an argument? Take a moment and make your choice. Now, as we learned in the first video, I believe a lot of the same things are going to apply. First off, make sure you get to the point. Don't repeat anything from the prompt. Just get directly to the reasons for your response. So, for example, if you do believe that taking risks is the better choice, then don't repeat the prompt. Basically, just say, I believe taking a risk is the better choice. And then start giving your reasons. Again, you have only 45 seconds, and they want to be able to see how well you can speak. Once again, think about giving 2 to 3 reasons. Now, 3 reasons might be too many. You certainly don't want to give the appearance that you're just listing information. But remember, the idea here is that we want to try to fill the time with as much meaningful information as we can. Remember to be specific. Use specific details to illustrate your reasons. And of course, connected to that involves using interesting vocabulary. Don't use words such as good or bad or nice. Use words that are more specific, that are stronger. Again, we need to use cohesive devices, including those signal words that will help connect information. And remember, signal words can come in many different varieties. And remember to try to avoid those filler ideas and other speaking errors that we often tend to hear. Words, such as you like, or no, or pauses, or repeating utterances such as or ah. We want to try to avoid those as much as possible. Now, of course, a few of those is not going to hurt. The idea here is that this is not a prepared speech. But again, try to be conscious of those and try to fill as much time as you can. Now, as I mentioned in the first video, I think sometimes a lot of TOEFL prep textbooks, not the ETS textbook, but other prep textbooks, suggest that this is some kind of personal essay, that you have some sort of formal introduction and a conclusion and so on. But I really don't think that's true. In my opinion, I think it's better to think of this as what we call an extemporaneous speaking activity. And really, extemporaneous speaking means delivering a spoken response using only a few prepared notes, and then relying on some basic organizational ideas and strategies. Again, as we mentioned in the first video, a lot of those organizational ideas involve getting to the point, getting and using specific details and information. Now, another tip, though, that I think is very helpful in both of the independent speaking tasks involve using personal examples. Oftentimes, students just want to give information, but I really believe that what the test is looking for is your ability to talk about yourself. So in this case, I think in order to make your response more memorable, and especially more interesting to listen to, use personal examples from your own life to add authenticity. Now for this topic, here are a couple of sample sentences that help kind of connect or show a personal connection. I believe taking risks is the best choice. When I was a first-year student at the university, so notice what I'm doing here is introducing a personal experience. Well, again, when we listen to a speaker, we want to know that they have some experience in this area. I mean, are you going to believe somebody who's never done this before? Clearly, if I have an example that I can use, or at least more than one, the key here is to recognize that a personal example might help emphasize the reasons that I'm going to make. I was able to find my dream job teaching kindergarten, but I had to take a chance and quit my first job and go back to school. So again, notice here I'm indicating the fact that part of taking this risk involved having to quit something that I already had and go back to school in order to find something that I thought was better. Again, a personal example is not a reason, but it helps to add more information to what I am saying. Sometimes we have to take a leap of faith in order to grow personally. I had never been to Haiti, but I decided to go on a mission trip to provide services to the earthquake victims. And in the process, I learned a lot about myself and about my mission in life. So again, notice in this example, the person is connecting to a particular trip that they made. Oftentimes, people, when they go to different countries or when they go on a volunteer trip, they often do learn a lot about what they can be. And sometimes we have to take that sort of leap of faith, as we call it. An opportunity that we take a little risk. Perhaps you had to leave your job for a while or take some time off and do something else. But in this case, maybe you found something new about yourself. So I think personal examples can often help provide something very helpful for the listener. It helps them to identify and visualize the information you're trying to give. So what I usually like to tell students, and I give this advice also on the writing section of the test, is don't just tell me that this is good for you, show me how it happened to you. And I also like to tell students that when you use details, the more personal it becomes, we can then find that everyone can relate to it. In other words, we can find the universal in the personal. I can connect to personal details, even though I'm not from your country. I certainly can recognize the specific things you're talking about because perhaps I've done something similar. So remember, show, don't just tell us. Give us those details. Don't just say it was important to you. Show us that it was important to you. Explain it. And remember that the deeper and the more detailed you can be, oftentimes the more that people can relate to it. And it doesn't matter where they live. Okay, now it's your turn. So pause the video and take a minute or two and try to deliver your response. And remember to use personal examples. So once again, here's the topic. So pause the video and then try to give a response. When you're finished, return to the video and then listen to a sample response that I'm going to give. I think for me, taking risks is the better choice. When I first started out as a teacher, I was teaching Spanish in high school to high school kids, and I really wasn't that happy with it. So I decided to quit my job, even though I was going to lose out on all that money, and get involved with the literacy program and work with adults, especially international students. And I noticed that it really made me a lot happier. So sometimes I realized that you have to take a risk in order to find personal happiness. I also think, too, it gave me the great opportunity to discover more about myself. By leaving this comfortable teaching job in a high school, I was actually able to find out what I was capable of doing. And so sometimes I would take even more risks, and even if I failed, I felt like I grew a lot more as a person. So I think really taking risks gives us that opportunity. So what did we hear in the response? Well, my first point talked about that taking a risk helped me find greater personal happiness. So the first thing I want to stress here in that taking a risk, the idea was that sometimes people think of taking a risk might help us make more money. But in my case, I decided to focus on the fact that taking risks sometimes also produce greater personal happiness. I wasn't really happy in my previous job, so when I quit, I realized that yes, I could lose a lot here, but the idea was that making money wasn't the most important. Being happy was more important. So sometimes taking a risk kind of illustrates that if I had stayed in my previous job, I probably would not have been very happy. The second point, too, we talked about was that taking this risk helped me learn more about myself, especially in the fact that when I took this one risk, it helped me take others in my job. Since my particular job is working with adults, oftentimes I get to try new things, which I didn't necessarily always get to try working in a high school environment. So in this case, it helped me learn more about myself and what I could do. Now again, when you gave your response, there are many different reasons and many examples that you could use. This is just one particular example that I wanted to share. And again, notice it didn't have to be a perfect response, but by using a personal example, it certainly helped me organize the response a little bit better and helped me identify the particular reasons that I wanted to give for my answer. Now, as we mentioned before, preparing for the test and, of course, preparing a response are two different things. So, much as I mentioned in the first video, I do believe that recording yourself is the best way to prepare for this part of the test. So again, practice a few times. Generally, I would not recommend more than 4 or 5 for each sitting. And the idea here is that when you practice, we need to follow some sort of systematic approach. So don't just record yourself 4 times in a row. As we mentioned in the first video, follow these steps. After preparing for your response, the first step should be recording yourself. But again, don't pay too much attention to the time. Just try to relax and do your best. Next, listen to that first recording and then think about the following things. Did I include everything I wanted to say? Was it interesting to listen to? Again, if it's the first time, the chances are it probably wasn't very interesting. Did I have many of the common speaking errors we discussed before? Well, again, did I include a lot of or ums, or did I repeat a lot of words? That happens a lot after the first time. And again, how long did it take me to respond? Most students either finish in too short a time, but sometimes it's difficult not to keep it just to 45 seconds. Our goal really is to fill 45 seconds with something interesting, not just with a lot of words. Again, step 3, record yourself. This time thinking about concentrating on eliminating ideas that weren't very successful, and perhaps adding more detailed information to the examples you gave. I had thought about giving 3 reasons, but my time was actually getting short, so I decided just to focus on 2 reasons in my example. And at this point, I also try to pay a little more attention to time. So if I was under 45 seconds, perhaps I needed to include up more information. My particular problem is I usually go very long. So in this case, if I went longer than 45 seconds, I probably gave too much information. So in this case, I wanted to focus on only the most interesting and relevant. So in this case, 2 reasons probably would be better than 3. And after step 3, I would recommend probably repeating this process a few more times. Go back and record yourself again, listen to yourself again, and I think eventually you'll get more and more comfortable with what you want to say. Now, obviously, you won't be able to do this on the real test, but the key here is that you have to be able to do this in a fast way. And I do believe that practice is the best way to do it. So, as you continue to get better at this, your time will also continue to improve. You'll become much more aware of the 45-second time limit instead of thinking about it too much. So, on the independent speaking task, paired choice, when we analyze the prompt, remember we discussed earlier that the question here is that we really have to make a choice. Now, the prompt itself gives us 2 choices, but remember, there could be the possibility that you could choose both, but you would have to specify when they would apply. And remember, when you make a choice, choose the answer or answers that give you the most to talk about. During that 15 seconds, again, try to write down maybe 2 to 3 basic reasons using short words or phrases, but still think about specific concrete details and interesting vocabulary. Just like we did with our pros and cons, you might want to think about some of the benefits and disadvantages to the argument you're trying to make. Many times when you look at a choice, it might be really easy to know which one you want to talk about. But again, take that 15 seconds and make sure you try to write down at least 1 word or 2 words. Try to do it as quickly as possible. And then finally, in delivering the response, remember to get to the point. Jump in and directly answer the question. Remember to use specific cohesive devices to organize your response. Don't just list information. Remember to avoid those common speaking errors. Don't repeat yourself a lot. And remember, don't worry about finishing in 45 seconds. If you finish in 43, that's perfectly fine. But the idea here is you need to fill up as much of the time as you can with something interesting. Finally, when we think about both independent speaking tasks, the idea here is that they are thumbnails of your speaking ability. So again, not a complete picture. But we want to make sure we fill as much of that 45 seconds with interesting, specific, and organized information that people would want to listen to. Now again, lots of recommended materials, the official TOEFL website, and of course the new TOEFL, the new ETS website, www.toeflgoanywhere.org. The official guide to the TOEFL test, again published by McGraw-Hill, but put together with ETS. And we also do have our new TOEFL TOEIC preparation website, the link that you can find at the bottom of the screen. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time for Part 3, Integrated Speaking Task, Read, Listen, Speak.